A homeless little boy sings a lullaby on the street, only for a passing billionaire to recognize the tune and freeze in shock. It's the one his ex-girlfriend used to sing to their newborn child. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Mason Sinclair stepped out of the towering glass skyscraper, adjusting the cuffs of his coat as a blast of winter air bit at his skin. The city hummed around him, taxis honking, people moving like clockwork, heads down, eyes forward. He had just wrapped up another meeting, numbers, projections, a merger on the horizon, but the details were already slipping from his mind. Deals like this were routine. Life, in its polished and calculated way, had settled into a rhythm he didn't question. As he strode toward his waiting car, something made him slow. A voice, soft but steady, wove through the sounds of the city. It was a child's voice, raw with the kind of emotion that didn't belong on a street corner. Mason turned his head, almost against his will, searching for the source. Across the street, near a shuttered storefront, a boy sat on the frozen pavement, knees drawn up, a tattered jacket wrapped tight around his thin frame. His head tilted down slightly, brown curls messy and unkempt, hands tucked beneath his arms for warmth. But it wasn't the boy's appearance that rooted Mason to the spot. It was the song. A lullaby, familiar yet distant, carried on the cold wind. The words clung to the air, weaving through time, pulling him back to a place he had long since buried. Olivia. She used to sing that song, whispering the melody into the dim light of their tiny apartment, cradling a baby that barely made a sound. A baby Mason had never once held. A baby that, if the timeline was right, would be about this boy's age. His chest tightened, logic warring with something deeper. It wasn't possible. This city was full of lost kids, scraping by, surviving. The lullaby could have come from anywhere. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he was imagining things. He turned sharply, forcing himself to walk away, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He had somewhere to be, something to do. That boy was not his problem. But the song stayed with him, threading itself through his thoughts long after he returned to his penthouse. That night, he poured himself a drink, then another, staring out at the skyline as memories clawed their way back. He hadn't thought about Olivia in years, hadn't let himself. She had left without a trace, without a word beyond the sharp, quiet truth that she could never forgive him. He had let her go. He hadn't fought for her, hadn't fought for the child she carried. He should have. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, he was irritable, snapping at Mason over something trivial before stepping into his car. His driver waited for instructions, but instead of heading straight to the office, Mason found himself muttering a different destination. When he arrived at the street corner, the boy was gone. The spot where he had sat was empty, save for a few crumpled newspapers and the faint indentation on the sidewalk where he had been. It shouldn't have mattered. It shouldn't have felt like a loss. Mason, ever observant, noticed his mood shift. Something wrong? Mason exhaled sharply. I need you to find someone. Mason didn't ask why, just nodded, phone already in hand. He had been with Mason long enough to know when not to press. By the end of the day, he had an answer. The boy's name was Justin. He had been on the streets for a while, bouncing between shelters, never staying in one place too long. His mother, Olivia, had died last year. No known relatives. No one looking for him. Mason stared at the information in front of him, the words blurring slightly. She was gone. Just like that. No final words, no confrontation. Just gone. And the child he had never met, the one he had so easily let slip from his life, was out there, alone, surviving on nothing but scraps and whatever street smarts he had picked up along the way. A sick sort of guilt settled deep in Mason's stomach, heavy and unshakable. He had spent years convincing himself that none of it mattered, that he had made his choices and so had Olivia. That whatever life she had built, wherever she had gone, was no longer his concern. But it wasn't just about her anymore. There was a boy out there with nowhere to go. A boy who had no idea that the man who had walked past him yesterday, the man who had done nothing but look away, was the same man who had once thrown away the chance to be his father. Mason set the file down, jaw tightening. He wasn't going to look away again. Mason hadn't slept. He had spent most of the night sitting in his study, staring at the file Mason had put together, rereading the same lines over and over as if they'd change. As if the ink would rearrange itself and tell him this wasn't real. That Olivia wasn't gone. That the boy on the street wasn't the son he had abandoned before he ever had the chance to know him. But the words stayed the same, stark and unmovable, and by the time the sky started shifting from black to gray, the reality had settled deep, leaving behind a weight he couldn't shake. He had never once searched for them. Not when Olivia left, not in the years that followed. It had been easier to let them fade, to tell himself it wasn't his problem, that they were better off without him. He had built an entire life on that lie, but now the truth was sitting in front of him, undeniable. His son was alone, surviving on whatever scraps he could find, and Mason had done nothing to stop it. By the time morning came, he had already made up his mind. Mason had tracked Justin to a soup kitchen a few blocks from where Mason had first seen him. The place wasn't much, tucked between buildings, its entrance easy to miss if you weren't looking. Mason hovered outside for longer than he cared to admit, watching as people trickled in and out, bundled against the cold. The longer he waited, the more foolish he felt. He had spent years negotiating deals with ruthless men, making decisions that changed entire industries, and yet here he was, hesitating at the door of a soup kitchen like a coward. He stepped inside. The place was warm, the air thick with the smell of broth and stale coffee. Volunteers moved behind long tables, handing out plates, their voices a low murmur beneath the scrape of utensils and quiet conversations. Mason scanned the room until his gaze landed on a familiar mess of curls near the back. Justin sat alone at a small table, hunched over a bowl, tearing a piece of bread into small bites before dipping it into the soup. His coat, too thin for the weather, looked even worse in the light. It wasn't just worn, it was barely holding together, the fabric frayed at the seams. He moved with the kind of sharp awareness that came from experience, glancing up every so often as if expecting trouble, like he had learned long ago that the world wasn't kind to kids like him. Mason approached slowly, pulling out the chair across from him without asking. Justin barely glanced up, his expression unreadable as he took another bite. "You following me or something?" The words were casual, but there was an edge beneath them. Mason set a paper bag on the table, sliding it toward him. "You looked like you could use something better than soup." Justin eyed the bag, then him, one brow lifting slightly. "What, you think just 'cause you wear a fancy coat, you can drop food in front of some poor kid and feel better about yourself?" Mason exhaled, pressing his lips together. He wasn't used to being dismissed so easily. "Just thought you might want a decent meal." Justin leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers against the table. "And what do you want?" Mason hesitated, then shrugged. "Nothing." Justin didn't sound convinced. He pulled the bag closer, but instead of opening it, he pushed it aside. "Look, man, I don't take handouts. If you're looking for some sob story to make yourself feel charitable, find someone else." Mason should have expected the resistance, but it still surprised him. Most kids in his position would have taken the food without question. But Justin wasn't most kids. There was something in the way he held himself, the way he watched people, calculating, always 2 steps ahead. "Fair enough," Mason said, leaning back slightly. "How about a deal, then?" Justin smirked, amused but still wary. "Oh, this should be good. You take the food, and in exchange you tell me a little about yourself." Justin studied him for a long moment before shaking his head with a small laugh. "Yeah, no thanks. I don't do interviews." Mason didn't press. Instead, he nodded toward the soup. "You come here often? Why, you gonna start showing up every day now?" Mason tilted his head. "Maybe." Justin gave him a long, skeptical look before finally opening the bag. The smell of fresh, warm food filled the space between them, and despite his earlier resistance, Justin's fingers twitched slightly as he pulled out the sandwich inside. He took a careful bite, as if expecting it to disappear. They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the soup kitchen moving around them. Eventually, Justin spoke, his voice quieter than before. "My mom used to come here. Before she got too sick." Mason kept his expression neutral, but the words hit harder than he expected. He had already known Olivia had been sick, but hearing it from Justin made it real in a way that no file ever could. "She never let me beg," Justin continued. "Said it was better to figure things out on my own." He tore off a piece of the sandwich, eyes flickering toward the volunteers. "They're nice here, though. Some of them, at least." Mason wanted to ask more, but he knew better than to push. Instead, he let Justin steer the conversation, let him decide what to share. They talked about the soup kitchen, about the best places to sleep when the shelters were full, about how he could tell which people would actually help, and which ones just wanted to pretend they cared. But not once did Justin mention his father. And Mason, for now, let him believe he was just another stranger. Later, after Justin had gone, Mason made a quiet call. He arranged for extra food to be sent to the soup kitchen, for a shelter nearby to hold a bed open, for an envelope of money to be slipped into Justin's belongings. He told himself it was just a precaution, just in case. The next morning, Mason walked into Mason's office, dropping a sealed envelope onto his desk. "You'll want to see this." Mason opened it. Inside was the money he had arranged to be left for Justin. Every bill untouched. Mason let out a low whistle. "Kid's got pride." Mason stared at the envelope for a long moment before setting it aside. "Find out where he's staying." Mason hesitated. "You sure about this?" Mason didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure about anything. All he knew was that Justin was out there, alone, and for the first time in his life, Mason wasn't willing to walk away. Mason had expected resistance, but he hadn't expected the level of stubbornness Justin possessed. The kid had pride, a sharp survival instinct, and a deep-rooted distrust that ran through every interaction. The returned money had been proof enough. He didn't take handouts, and he wasn't looking for saviors. Mason had to find another way in. Mason had managed to track Justin's usual movements. He bounced between shelters, soup kitchens, and on nights when everything was full, a hidden spot near an old construction site where he slept under a collapsed scaffolding. It was brutal, but he made it work. Mason could have easily paid to get him into a permanent shelter, pulled some strings, made a few calls. But that wasn't the solution. Justin wouldn't take something for nothing. So, Mason decided to give him a reason to take it. The next time he ran into Justin, it wasn't by accident. He found him sitting near a small bookstore, watching people walk by, hands buried in the pockets of his too-thin coat. He wasn't begging, just observing, like he was waiting for the right moment to grab an opportunity no one else saw. Mason sat down beside him without a word. Justin glanced at him, unimpressed. "You stalking me now?" "Thought about it," Mason said. "Figured I'd try a business offer instead." Justin scoffed. "What, you want me to shine your shoes or something?" "No, but I could use someone to run errands for one of my offices. Nothing complicated. Pick up deliveries, keep things stocked. I pay in food, since I know you don't trust money." Justin studied him, the gears turning in his head. He didn't reject it outright, which meant he was considering it. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "Fine. But if this is some rich guy guilt thing, I'm out." Mason smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." The first few days were rough. Justin was wary of stepping inside the pristine glass building, suspicious of every overly polite employee. He treated the whole thing like a con, waiting for the catch, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. But Mason let him work at his own pace. Mason, who found the whole thing wildly entertaining, made a point of playing along. "Kid's got nerve," Mason said one afternoon after Justin had delivered a brutally honest critique of Mason's office. Said your desk looks like it belongs to a guy who doesn't actually do any work. He's not wrong, Mason admitted. Justin quickly made himself too comfortable, if Mason's laughter was anything to go by. He had no problem roasting Mason's overpriced suit choices, his unnecessarily complicated coffee order, or the fact that his office had more books on finance than actual interesting reads. He'd walk into meetings, snatch a snack from the conference table, and leave without a word. Employees were both confused and entertained by the sharp-tongued kid who showed up like he owned the place. Mason didn't mind. It was the first time in years that someone wasn't afraid to call him out. And it wasn't just the attitude, it was the way Justin moved through the world, sizing everything up like he was already 10 steps ahead. He saw angles other people missed, read people faster than most adults. Mason recognized it, because he had once been the same way. But what really hit him was the moment he caught Justin lingering near the office bookshelf. It wasn't the finance books that caught his attention, it was a worn copy of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn tucked between them. Mason hadn't touched it in years, but Justin reached for it, fingers grazing the spine before he snatched his hand back like he had been caught stealing. You like books? Mason asked casually. Justin shrugged. Not really. The next day, there was a new book waiting on the break room table, no questions asked. Justin didn't acknowledge it, but by the end of the day, it was gone. Things were getting better. Mason was starting to feel like he was actually making progress, like maybe this was the way in. But then everything went sideways. One evening, Justin didn't show up for his usual shift. Mason told himself not to overthink it, but as the hours ticked by, unease settled deep in his chest. When Mason finally called with an update, his voice was tense. Found him, Mason said. It's bad. Mason was already out the door before Mason could finish. When he arrived, Justin was slumped against the side of a building, bruises blooming across his face, one arm curled protectively around his ribs. His clothes were even more torn than usual, his lips split. Mason crouched beside him, voice tight. What happened? Justin waved him off weakly. Just a misunderstanding. Mason felt his jaw clench. With who? Justin let out a dry laugh. Some guys at the shelter didn't like me taking more than my share. More than his share. The words made Mason's stomach turn. Justin had probably taken an extra meal, maybe an extra blanket, and for that, he had gotten beaten half to death. Mason didn't think. He just scooped Justin up before the kid could protest and carried him straight to his car. Justin groaned but didn't have the strength to fight him off. At the private clinic, the doctor patched him up, muttering something about old injuries, about how this wasn't the first time he'd taken a beating. Mason swallowed back the anger that threatened to boil over. He stayed by Justin's side, waiting, watching as the kid slept off the pain. Hours later, when Justin finally stirred, his voice was hoarse. I'm fine. You can stop hovering now. Mason didn't move. You're staying somewhere safe. Justin's expression darkened. No. You don't have a choice. Justin sat up slowly, wincing. I do. I always have. Mason exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. I can't do this, Justin. I can't just sit back and watch you get hurt. Not when Dash. He stopped himself. Justin caught the hesitation. His tired eyes narrowed. Not when what? Mason hesitated. He had planned to wait, to ease into it, to give Justin space to trust him first. But the truth was pressing down on him, suffocating, and the sight of the kid battered and broken had stripped away his patience. He met Justin's gaze and said the words before he could stop himself. Because I'm your father. Silence. Justin stared at him, unblinking. Then he let out a short, disbelieving laugh. That's funny. You actually had me for a second. Mason didn't move. I'm not joking. Justin's expression changed. The exhaustion, the guarded amusement, everything drained away until all that was left was cold, hard silence. He looked at Mason like he was seeing him for the first time, and whatever he saw, It wasn't good. Mason braced himself, waiting for something: anger, disbelief, anything. But Justin just shook his head and pushed himself off the bed. I'm leaving. You're not in any condition to dash. I don't care. Mason reached for him, but Justin jerked away. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a knife. Where were you? Mason's throat tightened. Justin scoffed. Yeah, that's what I thought. He took an unsteady step toward the door. Mason stood frozen, watching him go, feeling something break deep inside him. He had finally told the truth, and just like that, he had lost him again. Mason stood frozen, watching Justin walk out of the clinic, the weight of his own words still thick in the air. He had expected anger, had braced himself for questions, accusations, but he hadn't expected the quiet, empty look that had settled on Justin's face before he turned away. It was worse than shouting. Worse than the sharp edge of disbelief. It was the look of someone who had spent his whole life hearing empty promises, and wasn't about to fall for one now. He forced his legs to move, catching up just as Justin shoved the clinic door open and stepped into the cold. Justin, wait! Justin kept walking, his steps unsteady but determined. Don't. You're not in any shape to be out here. Not your problem. Mason felt something tighten in his chest. Yes, it is. That stopped Justin. He turned, laughter breaking out of him, sharp and humorless. Since when? Since 5 minutes ago, when you decided to tell me? He shook his head, something bitter behind his eyes. That's not how this works. Mason took a step closer, careful not to push too hard. I should have told you sooner. I should have should have what? Justin cut in. Should have looked for me? Should have been there? Yeah, well, you weren't. He scoffed, shaking his head. It's hilarious, really. You're out here throwing money around like it fixes everything, like it makes up for the fact that you weren't there when my mom was sick. When she needed help. When I needed help. His voice cracked, just slightly, and he swallowed hard, forcing it back down. So why now? Why do you suddenly care? Mason felt the words catch in his throat. There was no excuse. No answer that would fix what had already been broken. But Justin deserved the truth. Because I was a coward, he admitted. Because I made a mistake. I cheated on your mother. She left and I let her. I didn't fight for her, for you. I told myself it was better that way, that she'd be happier without me, and I let her walk away. I didn't try to find her. I should have. His voice was quieter now, steady despite the weight in his chest. But I didn't. Justin stared at him, his body tense like he wanted to run but couldn't make himself move. So that's it. His voice was hoarse. You just gave up? You let her leave and never even thought to check if we were okay? I thought about it every day. Justin let out a shaky breath, his hands balling into fists. Well, guess what? Thinking about it didn't help her when she was dying in some rundown apartment. It didn't help me when I had to sit there, watching it happen. His breathing was unsteady now, his voice raw. Thinking about it doesn't mean anything. Mason reached out, but Justin stepped back sharply. Don't. Justin. No. He shook his head, his voice rising. You don't get to do this. You don't get to show up now and pretend to care like it changes anything. You were too late. He turned, walking away, faster this time, his shoulders rigid. Just stay out of my life. Mason's pulse pounded in his ears as he took a step forward, but Justin was already running. He called after him, but Justin didn't look back. The boy vanished into the streets, swallowed by the city, and Mason felt something inside him sink lower than it ever had before. He had lost him again. For the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. There was no business deal he could negotiate, no money he could throw at the problem, no solution he could buy. He had spent his entire career fixing things, building an empire on the idea that there was always a way forward. But this wasn't a contract. It wasn't a transaction. It was a 17-year mistake that no amount of wealth could undo. Mason called him 3 times that night. He didn't answer. Instead, he went back to the place where he had first seen Justin, the spot where the boy had sat on the frozen pavement, singing the lullaby that had changed everything. He stood there as the rain started to fall, cold and relentless, soaking through his expensive coat. He waited. He wasn't sure how long, an hour, maybe more. Cars splashed past, headlights cutting through the downpour, but Justin never appeared. The city moved on around him, indifferent. Mason stayed until his hands were stiff with cold, until the rain had seeped through every layer of fabric, until the street emptied and silence stretched long into the night. Still, Justin never came. Eventually, he turned away, his footsteps heavy as he walked back toward the car, rainwater dripping from his hair. He had spent years convincing himself that none of it mattered, that Olivia and the child she had taken with her were nothing more than ghosts of a past he had left behind. But now, standing on an empty street in the middle of the night, he realized the truth. He had never really stopped waiting for them to come back. Mason barely slept. Every hour that passed without any sign of Justin felt like another failure, another reminder of just how much time he had already lost. Days slipped by, and the streets offered no answers. The kid had vanished like smoke, like he had never existed at all. Mason and an entire security team combing the city, checking shelters, hospitals, even the soup kitchens where Justin had once been a regular. Nothing. The streets were good at swallowing people whole, especially kids who knew how to disappear. And Justin had been surviving on them for years. Mason tried to reason with him, saying they had done all they could, that Justin would turn up when he wanted to. But Mason couldn't let it go. He barely touched his food, spent most of his time pacing, his phone never leaving his hand. Every time it rang, he answered before the first tone had even finished, only to be met with disappointment. "You need to take a break," Mason said after the third sleepless night. "You're going in circles." Mason barely looked up from his phone. "I already lost him once. I won't do it again." Mason exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I get it, but no, you don't." Mason's voice was sharper than he meant for it to be, but he didn't care. He was exhausted, frustrated, angry at himself more than anyone. "You don't get what it's like knowing you had a kid out there and did nothing. You don't get how many times I could have picked up the phone, looked for Olivia, tried to fix what I broke. But I didn't. And now she's gone, and he cut himself off, shaking his head. "I don't get to lose him too." Mason didn't argue. He just nodded and went back to his phone, making more calls, reaching out to more contacts. The search continued. It wasn't until the 5th day that they got their first real lead. A street vendor near an abandoned construction site recognized Justin's description. Said he'd seen the kid a couple of nights ago, looked like he was trying to keep a low profile. Didn't stay long. Mason was already out the door before Mason could finish the sentence. The warehouse was exactly what Mason expected, half collapsed, rusted metal beams leaning precariously, broken windows gaping like hollow eyes. It had probably been a storage facility at some point, long before the city moved on and left it behind. A perfect place for someone who didn't want to be found. Mason stepped inside carefully, the floor littered with old debris, the air damp with the scent of mildew and rust. The light from outside barely reached past the entrance, leaving the corners thick with shadows. For a second, he thought the vendor had been wrong. Then, in the farthest corner, barely visible beneath a pile of old blankets and newspapers, there was movement. Mason's chest tightened. Justin was curled up on the floor, his small frame shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Even from a distance, it was clear something was wrong. His usual sharpness, the quick wit and stubborn defiance, was gone. He looked fragile in a way that Mason wasn't prepared for. He crouched down, voice low. "Justin!" No response. Mason reached out, pressing a hand to the boy's forehead. Heat radiated off him in waves. A fever. "Justin, wake up!" The boy stirred slightly, his lashes fluttering, his breath uneven. His face twisted in confusion, his voice barely a whisper. "What?" Mason didn't waste time. He scooped him up, ignoring the weak protest as Justin tried unsuccessfully to push him away. "Put me down!" Justin slurred, his fingers gripping weakly at Mason's sleeve. "Not happening." Justin's head lolled against his chest, his fight already slipping away. "Don't need help." Mason tightened his grip. "Yeah, you do." The car was waiting outside, Mason holding the door open before Mason even reached it. Justin barely stirred as Mason slid into the back seat, keeping the kid tucked against him as they sped off toward the clinic. Mason glanced back. "How bad?" "Fever. Dehydration." Mason shifted slightly, adjusting Justin's weight. "He's burning up." Mason didn't say anything else. By the time they reached the clinic, Justin was barely conscious. The doctors moved quickly, getting him onto N4, checking his vitals. Mason stood off to the side, hands clenched, watching as they worked. "He's exhausted," one of them finally said, glancing over. "His body's been under too much stress. Probably hasn't eaten properly in days. The fever should break once we get some fluids in him." Mason nodded stiffly. "What do we do in the meantime?" "Let him rest." So that's what Mason did. He sat beside the hospital bed, arms crossed, watching the slow rise and fall of Justin's chest, the way his fingers twitched slightly even in sleep, like he was always bracing for something. Hours passed. At some point, Justin stirred. His brow furrowed slightly, his body shifting under the blankets. Then, his eyes opened just enough to register where he was. His voice was hoarse. "I told you not to follow me." Mason exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. "You say a lot of things." Justin let out a weak sound that might have been a laugh. Or maybe just a breath. Either way, it was something. Mason leaned back slightly, studying him. "You scared me, you know." Justin blinked slowly, as if processing that, then shrugged. "Wasn't planning on it." "Yeah, well, you did." Silence settled between them, heavy but not as sharp as before. Justin shifted under the blankets, adjusting slightly. "I'm still mad at you. I figured." Another pause. Then, softer this time, almost grudgingly. "Thanks for coming." Mason didn't say anything. Just nodded. Justin closed his eyes again, exhaustion pulling him under. But he didn't fight sleep this time. Didn't flinch when Mason reached over and carefully pulled the blanket higher around his shoulders. For the first time in days, Mason let himself breathe. He wasn't going anywhere. Mason didn't give Justin a choice. After the fever broke and the doctor cleared him, he had him in the car before the kid could come up with a half-decent argument. Justin was too weak to fight, but that didn't mean he wasn't complaining the whole way. "I don't need a babysitter," he muttered, arms crossed as he slumped in the passenger seat. "Good," Mason said, eyes on the road. "Because I'm not offering." Justin huffed but didn't have the energy for a real fight. He was still pale, his body drained from the days of exhaustion and sickness. Mason caught him sneaking a glance at the window, watching the city blur past. 15 minutes later, they pulled up in front of Mason's building. Justin's expression barely flickered as he stepped out of the car, but Mason could feel the shift in his posture as he took in the towering structure of glass and steel. The doorman greeted them, opening the lobby doors without hesitation. Justin didn't react, but as they stepped inside, his head tilted slightly upward, scanning the marble floors, the high ceilings, the massive chandelier. He let out a slow breath. "Yeah, this seems excessive." Mason led him to the elevator, hitting the top floor button. "You get used to it." Justin leaned against the railing as the doors slid shut. "Doubt it." The penthouse was just as quiet as Mason had left it. Too quiet. The kind of silence that made a place feel empty even when someone was inside it. Justin stepped in cautiously, eyes flicking around the massive open space, taking in the modern furniture, the sleek kitchen, the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. After a moment, he turned back to Mason, deadpan. So, do rich people not believe in normal stuff? Where's the TV? Where's the clutter? This looks like a showroom. Mason shrugged, tossing his keys onto the counter. I don't spend much time here. Yeah, no kidding. Justin wandered toward the kitchen, peeking inside the fridge before letting out a snort. Called it. Mason frowned. Called what? Justin grabbed a bottle of overpriced mineral water and held it up. You have nothing in here except fancy water and wine. No food. No snacks. Just pure, uncut, rich guy nonsense. Mason crossed his arms. I order out. Of course you do. Justin shook his head and shut the fridge. You really don't live here, do you? Mason didn't answer right away. It had never really felt like a home, just another place to exist in between meetings, another asset he owned. He had spent years collecting wealth, building businesses, expanding his reach, but when he looked around now, all he saw was how empty it was. Justin stretched his arms with a wince, then looked around again. So where's my room? Mason gestured toward the guest wing. Down the hall. First door on the left. Justin didn't argue, just nodded and shuffled off, clearly too exhausted to care. For the first few days, things were tense. Justin didn't trust the space. He walked like he was waiting for someone to kick him out, flinched every time Mason told him he didn't have to do anything in return for being there. He refused to ask for anything, only eating what was put in front of him, only using what he was given. Mason stocked the kitchen with actual food, only to find Justin still hesitant to touch anything unless Mason explicitly told him to. So Mason decided to change tactics. One night, he dragged Justin into the kitchen, rolling up his sleeves. Come on. You don't like the food situation? Then we fix it. Justin raised a brow. You're gonna cook? Is that even allowed? Mason smirked. Watch and learn. It turned out that Justin had little patience for rich guy fumbling in the kitchen. He roasted Mason mercilessly as he struggled with simple tasks, muttering things like, You're holding that knife like a serial killer. And, I've seen toddlers crack eggs better than you. It took longer than it should have, but eventually, they managed a half-decent meal. And that was the first night Mason saw something shift. Justin actually enjoyed himself. He relaxed, let his guard down, even really laughed. It was the first time the tension between them didn't feel like a wall. After that, the rhythm between them changed. Justin, now stronger, took it upon himself to point out every absurdity about Mason's lifestyle. He made fun of the smart home system. Why do you need an AI to turn on your lights? Are your hands broken? The price of the furniture. You paid how much for this couch? It's not even comfortable. And the private gym Mason never used. I'd sell this entire room for a burger and be way happier. Mason, to his own surprise, found himself actually enjoying it. The kid had a way of cutting through all the nonsense, of making Mason look at his own life and realize how ridiculous it all was. And then, one night it happened. Mason had been in his office, sorting through paperwork, when he heard something faint from the living room. A melody, soft but familiar. The lullaby. He hesitated, then walked out, stopping in the hallway just out of sight. Justin was sitting on the couch, curled up with one of the books Mason had left out for him, humming absent-mindedly as he flipped through the pages. He probably didn't even realize he was doing it. Mason swallowed, something catching in his throat. Without thinking, he leaned against the wall and softly joined in. Justin froze for a second, the humming stopping mid-note. Then, after a beat, he kept going, his voice steady. They hummed the rest of the song together, either looking at the other, either acknowledging it. But when it ended, something felt different. That night, Mason sat in his study long after Justin had gone to bed, staring out at the skyline. He had spent his entire life running from the idea of being a father, from responsibility, from the weight of what he had lost. But he didn't want to just help Justin anymore. He wanted to be his father. The lullaby stayed with Mason long after that night, threading itself through his thoughts in moments of quiet. He didn't bring it up, and neither did Justin, but something between them had shifted. The walls weren't as thick, the silence between them no longer weighed down with resentment. It wasn't perfect. Justin was still sharp-tongued, still independent to a fault, still had moments where he kept his distance, but the tension that had once defined their every interaction had lessened. Mason started finding small signs of trust where there had been none before. Justin no longer hesitated to take food from the fridge, no longer hovered near the door like he was waiting to be kicked out. He still slept lightly, still flinched at unexpected noises, but he stayed. And that, Mason knew, meant something. One evening, Mason came home late after a business dinner and found Justin on the couch, dozing off with a book still open on his lap. A bowl of half-eaten ramen sat on the coffee table, and a blanket one Mason was sure Justin wouldn't have taken willingly was draped loosely over his legs. It was such a normal sight, something so painfully ordinary, that it caught Mason off guard. He stood there for a long moment, just watching. This was what he wanted. Not out of guilt, not out of responsibility. He wanted to be here. To see Justin grow into someone who didn't have to fight for every scrap of survival. He wanted to earn the right to be a father. But then, just when everything seemed to be settling into something steady, it all came crashing down. The next morning, Justin was gone. At first, Mason didn't think much of it. The kid was restless, always needed to be moving, and he had never been good at sticking to one place for too long. But when noon rolled around with no sign of him, unease crept in. Calls to Mason and the security team turned up nothing. No one had seen him leave. No messages, no notes, nothing. By evening, panic had taken hold. Mason's team scoured the usual places: soup kitchens, abandoned buildings, old shelters, but there was no trace of him. The thought of Justin back on the streets, vulnerable, alone, made Mason's stomach twist. He called in every favor he had, demanded every resource at his disposal, but the city was too big, and Justin was too good at disappearing. Then, just as desperation started turning to dread, Mason called. Hospital. Downtown General. Mason didn't ask how bad it was. He already knew. The drive was a blur. The moment he stepped through the hospital doors, he was met with the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic, the quiet hum of machines, the low murmur of voices. He barely heard what the nurse was saying as she led him down the hallway. And then he saw him. Justin lay motionless in the hospital bed, the steady beep of the heart monitor the only proof that he was still here. His face was pale, bruises blooming along his arms, a thin tube feeding oxygen into his nose. The sight of him like that, fragile and unmoving, was worse than anything Mason had ever prepared himself for. The doctor spoke, but Mason barely absorbed the words at first. Accident. Reckless driver. Hit while crossing the street. Internal injuries. A serious concussion. They didn't know the full extent of the damage yet. They didn't know if he'd make it. Mason sank into the chair beside the bed, hands gripping the edge of his knees. His mind raced with every possibility, every worst-case scenario, but beneath all of it was one simple, terrible truth. Justin had left to see someone. A friend from the streets, a younger kid he had looked after before Mason found him. Because no matter how much security Mason had wrapped around him, no matter how much he had tried to convince Justin that he didn't have to live that life anymore, the boy had still felt responsible for someone else. And now, because of that, he was here. Because Mason hadn't been careful enough. Because he had let his guard down and believed, for one stupid moment, that things would be fine. The nurse came in to check his vitals, adjusting the foredrip. Mason barely moved. His gaze stayed locked on Justin's face, waiting for any sign that he would wake up. He reached out, carefully, hesitantly, brushing his fingers against the back of Justin's hand. "I should have been there," he said softly. "I should have found you sooner." His throat felt tight, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. "You deserve better than this." The monitors beeped steadily. Justin didn't stir. Mason exhaled, his head dropping forward as he pressed his hands together, fingers interlocked. He hadn't prayed in years, hadn't believed in anything beyond what he could control. But right now, he had nothing but hope, and he held on to it like a drowning man clutching at the last scrap of a lifeline. He had spent his whole life fixing things, making decisions, controlling outcomes. But this was the one thing he couldn't fix. All he could do was wait. The days stretched long. The rhythmic beeping of machines became the background to every hour, blending into the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of hospital staff. Mason barely left Justin's side. He sat in the stiff chair beside the bed, elbows resting on his knees, watching the slow rise and fall of the boy's chest, waiting for any sign that he'd wake up. He barely registered time passing, Mason dropping off fresh clothes, the nurses reminding him to eat, the doctors coming in with updates that all sounded the same. No change. Just wait. Waiting had never been something Mason was good at. He built his entire life on control, on action, on making things happen. But here, there was nothing he could do except sit and watch and hope. Hope that Justin would wake up, that he wouldn't be too late again, that this wasn't the final chapter in a story he had barely started writing. At some point, when the weight of it all felt unbearable, he started talking. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the helplessness, or maybe he just needed to say it out loud to someone who couldn't walk away this time. I spent years telling myself it wasn't my problem, he murmured, his voice quiet in the still room. That you and Olivia were better off without me. That I wouldn't have been a good father anyway, so it was easier to just not try. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared that I'd screw it up. Scared that I'd be the kind of man my own father was, distant, cold, never there when it mattered. And instead of proving myself wrong, I let that fear make my decisions for me. The machines kept beeping, Justin kept breathing, and Mason kept talking. I should have found you sooner. I should have looked for you when Olivia left, fought for you, fought for her. But I didn't. And I've been making excuses ever since. He swallowed, glancing at Justin's still face. You deserve better. You still do. Silence settled again, heavy and unmoving. Mason let his forehead rest in his hand, his other still gripping Justin's wrist, thumb absently brushing over the floor taped to his skin. He wasn't even sure Justin could hear him. Maybe he was just saying it for himself. Maybe that was the point. And then so faint he almost missed it, there was movement. A slight twitch against his palm. Mason froze. Then another. He jerked upright, eyes snapping to Justin's hand just as the boy's fingers curled weakly around his own. A second later, Justin's breathing shifted, his head turning just slightly on the pillow. His eyelids fluttered, his brows furrowing like he was trying to piece together where he was. Then, with a slow, painful blink, his gaze lifted. The first thing out of his mouth was barely above a whisper. You look awful. Mason let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a laugh, one hand coming up to press against his face as the weight in his chest cracked open. Yeah, well, haven't exactly been getting my beauty sleep. Justin made a rough noise that might have been a laugh if he wasn't still so weak. His fingers loosened around Mason's hand but didn't let go completely. Hospital food sucks, he muttered after a long moment. Mason huffed, shaking his head. Not exactly the first thing I expected you to complain about. A few beats of silence passed before Justin's voice softened. You stayed. Mason's throat tightened. Of course I did. Justin studied him, tired but aware, like he was still processing everything. Mason let him take whatever time he needed. Eventually, Justin exhaled, shifting slightly under the blankets. I'm still mad at you, he admitted. Mason nodded. I know. A pause. Then, quieter, almost grudgingly, dash. I think I kinda like having you around, though. It was small. It wasn't a grand declaration or some big, dramatic moment. But it was enough. Months later, things weren't perfect, but they were real. Justin healed. Slowly, At first, weeks of physical therapy, of getting his strength back, of relearning how to trust that he wasn't alone anymore. He still had moments where he kept his guard up, still had habits from the streets that he hadn't fully shaken. But Mason was patient. Or at least, as patient as someone like him could be. The adoption papers went through faster than either of them had expected. Mason joked that it was because no judge wanted to argue with Mason Sinclair, but Mason knew it was more than that. It was because he meant it. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just throwing money at a problem and hoping it would go away. He was staying. The night after everything was finalized, Justin stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "So that's it, huh?" Mason raised a brow. "That's it." Justin smirked. "I mean, I figured you'd put up more of a fight. Maybe make me beg to stay." Mason rolled his eyes. "Not my style." Justin snorted. "Yeah, right. Mr. I own half the city suddenly doesn't like control. Watch it, kid." Justin grinned, pushing off the counter. "What happens now?" Mason exhaled, leaning back against the opposite counter. "I guess now we figure it out." That night, their first official family night, was a disaster in the best way. Mason had brought over a stack of movies, and somehow, what should have been a simple decision turned into a full-blown argument. Justin was firmly against anything Mason picked, calling his taste old man boring. Mason refused to watch anything animated. Mason, acting as the self-proclaimed voice of reason, kept making them restart the selection process every time they started throwing popcorn at each other. Somewhere in the middle of the chaos, as they bickered over whether action movies from the 90s counted as classics or just old, Justin started humming under his breath. The lullaby. Mason heard it immediately, and this time, it wasn't sad. It wasn't something Justin sang to himself when he thought no one was listening, wasn't a quiet reminder of a life he had lost. It was natural, unconscious. Comforting. Mason caught Mason's eye, and Mason, ever observant, just nodded once, understanding. Without thinking, Mason hummed along. Justin faltered for a split second, then kept going, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm. It was the simplest thing, but as Mason sat back, surrounded by popcorn-covered chaos, something settled in his chest. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just Mason Sinclair, billionaire CEO. He was a father. Years passed, but some things remained the same. The penthouse wasn't as pristine as it used to be. Mason had long since given up on keeping everything spotless when Justin made it his mission to fill the place with signs of life. Sneakers abandoned in the hallway, half-finished books stacked in odd places, a kitchen that was actually used for cooking instead of just storing expensive water bottles. It wasn't the home Mason had envisioned for himself years ago, but it was the one he wouldn't trade for anything. Justin grew. He was still sharp, still stubborn, still had a habit of calling Mason out on every ridiculous rich guy habit, but the edges of his sarcasm had softened. He still didn't take handouts, but he didn't push away help anymore, either. He had gotten his GED and was considering college **. Not because I want to, don't get mushy on me, but because I don't want to be a broke idiot. And Mason had never been prouder. And then there was her. Mason met Claire on one of those rare afternoons when Justin convinced him to step outside his office and be a normal human for once. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a casual run-in at a coffee shop where Mason, too distracted by a business call, had nearly walked off with her order instead of his own. She had laughed, taking her cup back without missing a beat. "You don't even seem like a cappuccino guy," she had said, tilting her head at him. Mason had blinked, caught off guard. "I'm not." "Then why did you order one?" "I didn't." Realization had dawned, and then, to his horror, Justin had been there to witness the entire thing. "Oh," Justin had drawled, smirking. "This is gold." Claire had looked between the two of them, clearly amused. "I take it you two are related?" Mason had hesitated. He still wasn't used to explaining it, but before he could speak, Justin had shrugged. "Yeah. He's my dad," That had been the moment Mason realized how far they'd come. Claire was nothing like the people in Mason's world. She was warm, quick-witted, had a laugh that filled a room instead of just politely blending into it. She ran a small nonprofit for at-risk youth, which Justin found hilarious. Asterisk. Oh, so now you're dating a social worker? Guess you really are going soft. Asterisk. But even with the teasing, Justin had liked her. Mason could tell. What started as something casual became something real. And to Mason's surprise, it felt natural. Claire never made a big deal about his wealth, never seemed impressed by his power. She just liked him. And Justin, ever the cynic, watched quietly from the sidelines, waiting for something to go wrong. But it never did. Years passed, and Justin became a young man with a life of his own. He still lived at the penthouse, but he came and went on his own terms, always balancing between school, part-time work, and whatever odd project he decided to dive into next. He had stopped waiting for life to take things from him, and instead started figuring out what he wanted from it. One evening, the three of them, Mason, Claire, and Justin, sat in the living room, the city lights sprawling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a quiet moment, the kind that Mason had once never imagined having. Justin was flipping through channels, Claire curled up with a book, Mason just being. No meetings, no stress, no running from things that mattered. At some point, Justin let out a small laugh, shaking his head as he settled on a movie. What? Mason asked. Justin smirked. Just thinking. If someone had told me years ago that I'd end up here, watching some sappy movie with my family, I would have called them a liar. Mason leaned back, arms crossed. Who said anything about it being sappy? Justin gestured at the screen. There are literally people running through an airport for love. That's the sappiest thing I've ever seen. Claire laughed. I don't know, Mason. I think Justin might be right on this one. Mason exhaled, shaking his head. This is what I get for raising a smartass. Justin grinned. Not my fault. That's just good parenting. And just like that, Mason felt it again, that quiet, undeniable feeling of belonging. Justin hummed under his breath, almost absent-mindedly, and Mason recognized it immediately. The lullaby. Not out of habit, not out of sadness. Just something that had settled deep into who Justin was, something he carried with him. Mason hummed along. Claire listened, smiling softly, and for the first time in his life, Mason wasn't just a billionaire, wasn't just a man trying to make up for his mistakes. He was a father. And finally, he had a family. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.